Hello, my name is Tony Mansueto. Welcome to Seeking Wisdom and to our series on power and the common good. Today we will be talking about positioning strategy, which is about deciding how your organization can best contribute to the struggle to create a society which serves the common good, which cultivates the full range of human capacities. Before we begin, please remember to click like on the video, and also if you're interested in knowing more about what we're doing and continuing to pursue this series and many of the other online courses that we are going to be offering, please click subscribe. And if you're interested in supporting us, you can find the link to our Patreon page below. You'll also find links to some of our various other websites that explore similar issues in different ways. Perhaps at some point we'll do a little bit of a tour of those. Now, historically, strategic thinking has drawn on concepts from the domain in which it first developed, which was the art of war. Strategy is the art practiced by generals, who the term comes from the Greek strategoi, and strategoi were generals. And this remains truer at the higher levels of global and grand strategy that we have been discussing thus far, even when the context is not explicitly military. So, for example, we talk about taking and holding terrain, not just in a literal physical military sense, but also in a figurative, institutional, or organizational sense, or in a cultural sense. But unless you're leading an organization with the resources and reach to act at a global or civilizational level, which generally requires either a massive endowment or the ability to tax and conscript, then you need to make decisions regarding what you're going to focus on and how you're going to support that work. And that is really the question that our discussion of positioning strategy will try to help you answer. Now, positioning strategy and also portfolio strategy, which is closely related to it, and which we'll talk about in the next video, derives most of its concepts not from the military realm, but from the business world, since all firms must ask a similar set of questions. And in this sense, most organizations that are working for social justice are, in fact, firms in the economic sense, even if they're organized as non-profits of some kind. They have to do their political work while offering a good or service to someone who will pay for it in some way. And so that puts us economically in the situation of operating in a certain sense as a business. Now, just a brief word on the relationship between positioning strategy and portfolio strategy, since they're closely related and sometimes the terms are used interchangeably. Here we are making the distinction in the following way. Positioning strategy asks what sort of business we should be in. What is the value proposition that we're offering to which customer segments or core constituencies are we offering that value proposition? Portfolio strategy, which is often relevant even for relatively small organizations, looks at the same question in the plural, as it were. What different businesses should we be in? And how do we develop a portfolio of activities, a portfolio of value propositions related to distinct constituencies that make sense, that holds together, that are supportive of each other, and that enhance each other? And again, we'll get onto that in the next video. Now, the first question that we need to answer when we're trying to decide how we are going to position our organization is what comparative advantages we enjoy. What, given our interests and capacities and our take on global strategy, because we need to have one, can we do better than anyone else? What is our distinctive contribution? And you can answer this question by reflecting on a number of subordinate questions. First of all, what is most important to you? What are you trying to accomplish? Again, we might have a very long range global aim, a global strategic aim, but what is it that you are trying to accomplish in your life? What contribution do you want to make? And reflect on that and be sure that you are in fact concentrating on the things that are most important to you, because those are going to be the things at which you are ultimately most likely to excel. Second, what capacities do you bring to those tasks? In what activities do you excel or have the passion to work hard enough to excel? And how, given your aims and capacities, can you make the biggest contribution? Now you can see that although these are in a certain sense the same questions that a small business would ask, they are also profoundly relevant to the broader political context in which this series is operating. Because unless we understand our comparative advantage, we don't really know what our particular calling is. The next thing we have to ask about is our competition. Who is competing with us for people, money, or mana? Okay? That is absolutely critical. Again, just because we may share some broad common aims with other folks, it doesn't mean that we are not also competing with them for many of the same limited resources. And that's true throughout the nonprofit sector. And the nonprofit sector is basically the economic term for most organizations that are trying to build a better world. And then the second question, and this is really critical, how do we differ from them? Okay? If we don't differ from them at all, then we shouldn't be competing with them. Okay? We should be joining them. There is limited space. And unless we're bringing something that's distinctive, something new, something that sets us apart, that we think can help advance the struggle in ways that existing initiatives are not, then we really shouldn't be trying to start something independent. Once we've done that, then we need to look at our core constituencies. What does the overall market look like? What are the principal market segments? And this may be a little bit difficult to think through in certainly a more political nonprofit context. But, once you know, for example, whether you are a congregation-based community organization or a political party or an organization that is focused around a particular issue, then you have at least a range of different kinds of organizations that you see yourself as competing with and differentiating yourself from at the same time. And you can begin to look at what the market is that those organizations are accessing. And of course, your differentiation may open up new markets that aren't there for these other organizations. Or you may be looking at coming in and luring away some of the folks that have been supporting them. So you need to get a sense of what that overall terrain looks like. How big is it? In what ways is it segmented? In what ways is it divided up? And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. And then, who do you have relationships with? Okay? In general, it's very difficult to succeed in the long run if you're not developing new relationships. But it's also very difficult if you don't have some core of people who are supporting you. And so who do you have relationships with? Who are the next people that you can develop relationships with? That is really critical to know. Third, what are their values and interests? What are they trying to accomplish? Okay. One of the very difficult things, I think, for a lot of us to get our minds around is that the people that we're trying to organize may have interests that are significantly different from our own. And that doesn't mean that we can't collaborate with them. That doesn't mean that we can't um, even lead them in new and challenging directions. But we need to understand their starting point. We need to see what their world looks like. We need to know what they're trying to accomplish right now. And then we need to know how they're realizing those values and interests or accomplishing those aims at this point. Because part of what we're going to be asking them to do is to approach those aims differently, because presumably we're offering a different way of addressing those interests. We may also end up suggesting other values, other interests, other things that they want to accomplish, but we need to make a start with what they're already trying to accomplish and suggest to them a different way of doing that, where we become important partners. And finally, where do those aims and ways of approaching things intersect with your most unique capacities? What do you bring that is different and better and that speaks to your actual or potential constituents? And that's really critical. There has to be that connect. There has to be some overlap there. Again, that doesn't mean that they are, 100% focused on the same thing that you're focused on, but there does have to be some kind of overlap. Now, before I move on, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the ways of analyzing a market and its segments, or a cluster of different core constituencies. The most basic way is demographic, in terms of class, gender, race and ethnicity, age, generation, religious affiliation, level and field of education. Okay? And those will always be fundamental for us, precisely because, given what we're trying to do, given that we're looking at trying to reorganize society, we are trying to speak to sociologically defined constituencies which have been oppressed or exploited or excluded in some way. And so these kind of demographic divisions are going to be important. But there are other types that are also important in terms of understanding where your particular organization is going to be able to find a niche. So there's also kind of a psychographic division. One of those is based on personality type. It's actually one of the biggest challenges that I face. You may have visited our website called Guide for the Perplexed, which is an attempt to engage people in the process of making an informed decision regarding their own spiritual path. We're developing a process called Finding Your Way. And one of the lures I'm trying to use is a quiz that helps people see where they fit currently in the enormous range of different alternatives that people have, different alternative spiritual paths that humanity's developed over the course of its history. And I developed a draft of the quiz and gave it to my wife, and her reaction was that, well, that will be great for INTJs. Because it reflects very much my way of approaching things. And so, could you have an organization that's devoted towards people with one personality type? Sure. But for the most part, we're looking for a broader range than that. And so we have to be aware that approaching people with different personalities is going to require different approaches. Social status, that can also be a demographic factor. It depends on how we're defining it. Beliefs and values, people's vocation or goals, lifestyle, hobbies, interests, things like that. All of those things can define a segment or core constituency. Geography can be very important. If you are working on issues related to land, if you're working on issues related to the ecosystem, then where people are located is going to play a big role in terms of how you address them. Whether they're urban, suburban, or rural, their citizenship, their language, their culture. And then finally, some behavioral factors that are going to be very important in terms of figuring out who you can approach and how. So how people decide to buy something or to donate funds to an endeavor. Do they browse on the internet? Do they do that exclusively through face-to-face interactions in a church or a synagogue or in a civic organization? If they are doing it online, which is probably true for more and more people today, what kind of technology are they using? What specific sites are they using? Do they have a particular kind of brand loyalty? And yes, that does exist in the nonprofit world as well. There are some people for whom, for example, the Democratic Party brand is absolutely fundamental and definitive of their identity. There are other folks for whom that may be a turnoff. And those folks might be otherwise very similar and both accessible to you, and you need to approach them in different ways. What kind of voting and other political behaviors do they have? What kinds of cultural experiences do they consume? Are they members of a religious community? Do they participate regularly? What kinds of spiritual practices are they involved in? So all of these are going to affect the segmentation of your market. And then all of these things come together where you link your comparative advantage with your core constituencies and find one or more niches which you can take and defend. A niche where you are bringing something that represents the best possible solution to a problem or question or aspiration posed by or advanced by the particular constituency that you're looking at. Okay, and that is really critical, and you need to know what that value proposition is. All right, so let's talk a little bit about different types of positioning strategy. And as we'll see, some of these may not be particularly relevant to people looking at new ventures in the social sector, but they provide important perspective so that we understand where what we are doing sits in a larger field. So the first strategy is basically positioning based on price, competing on price. You try to get people to choose your good, your service, because it's cheaper than any of the others. And that requires minimum investment in innovation or quality or training. And so there's a lower entry cost, generally speaking. But at the same time, it means that you're going to accomplish less, which again, in the kind of work that we're talking about, is a critical failing. And it also largely condemns you to lower levels of remuneration. So this is not, generally speaking, an effective approach for people who are trying to promote a higher degree of investment in human development. Second approach is to compete on the basis of quality. And here you are banking on the fact that you've established your reputation for quality. And once you've done that, as long as there's a demand for the good or service you're offering, you should have a secure position in the market. Now, the downside perhaps with this is that you have to actually both be the best and even more important than that, you have to be able to effectively communicate your superiority. So to give an example from the academic sector, where I'm guessing a lot of you are positioned, positioning based on quality, that's the Ivies. Okay? Harvard, Chicago, Princeton, Stanford, okay, the Ivies, and other high-end research universities. And positioning based on price would be something like a community college or an urban comprehensive. Now, could a community college invest and find a way to offer quality which was comparable to that of Harvard or Chicago? Of course, it should. There are probably community colleges that certainly have courses or programs that, particularly at the lower division undergraduate level, that are as good or better. Okay? But they are not in a position to effectively communicate that because of the weight of reputation, the weight of history, and also because there is actually a little bit of a mismatch between what, say, an academic institution offers and what its constituents or customers buy. So, whatever you may think of them, I think it's probably true that a great deal of people at high-end research universities are very much committed to quality, both in their research and their teaching. But that isn't necessarily what their students and their families of their students, especially at the undergraduate level, but at the graduate level as well probably, are actually buying. What they're buying is reputation. And so it's very hard to position yourself based on quality when a lot of what is actually being offered by your competing institutions is a reputation that has developed over hundreds of years, that's existed for hundreds of years, and that is backed now by enormous marketing resources, for example. And so that brings us to the strategy which is generally preferred by newcomers for obvious reasons, and that's to position yourself based on uniqueness. Okay? You need to be able to offer something that differentiates yourself from the competition so fundamentally that you are basically offering something that nobody else can. Okay? And if you can do that, then at least for a time, you'll enjoy a monopoly position and secure monopoly rents. And that is at the foundation of the way in which new ventures, really in any sector, get started. Now, that said, you have to continuously innovate because others will move in and copycat, others will undersell you, others may be able to do what you're doing and offer that veneer of prestige in a way that you can't for whatever reason. And so it's necessary that you are continuously innovating and differentiating as well. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to hold that particular position. Another way to look at this question is in terms of types of competition or market warfare. So you can take a defensive stance, an offensive stance, a flanking stance, or a guerrilla stance. And this will give us a little bit more of multiple alternatives in terms of what might be realistic for newcomers in the social sector. Defensive stance, you're basically a market leader who innovates and improves quality in order to defend your position. Okay, once again, if we're looking at the academic market, that's Harvard, that's Chicago, that's Stanford. You control a large sector of the market, and you have a lot of resources, and so you invest in making sure that you deliver what you're promising. Again, always be aware of that potential mismatch between the offer and what people are actually looking for there. An offensive strategy would be characteristic for close followers, and those are people who are going to attack the leader's weaknesses, the market leader's weaknesses, and avoid trying to compete with their strengths. So, for example, you might see there in the academic sector a small liberal arts college that was not quite as prestigious as the Ivies, but that offered smaller classes, more individualized attention, and still had a hefty dose of prestige. What they're not going to do is to try to have a full range research program that is comparable to a major research university. First of all, that's out of reach for them. And second, it's not necessarily going to be coherent with the message that they are giving to the people they're trying to engage. Third strategy is a flanking strategy, and that is one where newcomers avoid direct competition by offering something different, creating an element of surprise. And again, that's basically the uniqueness positioning that we were talking about earlier. And a variant of that is often adopted by smaller players who carve out a niche that is small enough for them to defend, but they also need to be prepared to leave it at a moment's notice. So a flanking strategy, again, is where you come in and you offer something that is different enough that you might well become a market leader or a close follower relatively quickly. So, for example, Apple in relation to Microsoft, a very, a different sort of experience with a personal computer. A guerrilla strategy, on the other hand, is something where you don't really expect to be able to hold that niche. You're going to enter it, you're going to accomplish something, but you're basically going to be blasted out of it by competition very quickly, and you're going to move on to something else. All right, so that gives us a sense of the range of strategies that we have available to us. In our next video, we are going to look at how we might link together various value propositions to create a portfolio of activities that are mutually supportive of each other. And I'd also like to talk a little bit about what you do when you have an organization that feels stuck in a low-end niche. So, for example, again, speaking to certainly a lot of the people who I have worked with over the years in community college work, we're there because we are dedicated to making a liberal education accessible to students who can't afford an Ivy League education, who can't afford to go to Chicago or Stanford or someplace like that, or who don't have the life flexibility, the mobility to be able to do that. But the low-end strategy, the emphasis on cost, is really crippling in the end, because it means that we never really try to be the best, and we never really try to innovate and do something distinctively different. And that means, particularly for those of us in the liberal arts, that we're not really meeting our aim. We're not really meeting our mission, which is to cultivate free human beings and engaged citizens, to do for students who come from working class communities, who come from communities of color, who maybe even are homeless, to do for them what Harvard does for the rich, and position them to become leaders across social institutions. And so I would like to spend some time talking about how we wrestle with those situations. Thank you very much. Please, assuming that you like the video, please like it through the like button, and subscribe to our channel, and visit our other websites, and consider supporting us through Patreon.